Sapientia operibus vindicata. Welcome back to the Fire of Liberty podcast. I'm Mr. Garcia, the head of school at Naples Classical Academy. This is the last time you'll have to hear me alone. After this podcast, we'll move into inviting some people onto the podcast, mostly staff members and maybe some students and things like that. And we'll have some really interesting conversations about the literature and the history and maybe I'll even bring a physics teacher on here and we'll talk about physics. So a lot of things to talk about, and they're great. But the first thing that has to happen is we have to understand who we are and what we do. In the last episode, we talked a little bit about what it means to be a human being. And I said, look, we're not just a body. We have an immaterial part of who we are. That's a pretty universal idea for most of history. That shouldn't be shocking to people. It shouldn't sound like I'm saying something scandalous or honestly, even with what I get sometimes, religious. It's not a religious idea to suggest that there are immaterial principles that exist. The notion that somehow, for example, the perfect example, honestly, is love, right? Every human person longs to be loved, and they long to be loved perfectly. And yet no one has quite experienced that in this life yet. Though we may say, hey, look, I got close a couple of times. No one has probably ever experienced that. And love by itself is not evidently a material thing, right? We manifest it in our actions, but it looks different in all these different ways, whether it's a hug or a kiss on the cheek or the gift of a beautiful rose or whatever, however, in whatever way it may look. Those are not the visible signs that objectively and universally always and everywhere indicate the immaterial notion of love, right? It is immaterial. And yet, I think we all have some notion that love itself has some objective standards to it. We can't say we truly love somebody if we're not willing to give something of ourselves up for them. There's a sacrifice involved in love, true love, right? And so the idea that man is purely material and doesn't have this immaterial capacity and not rational, doesn't have the power of the mind, the intellect, and the will to seek the truth and to know the good, that shouldn't be scandalous. And I think that is mostly been the notion throughout the course of history, this idea that I'm presenting. It certainly was the idea of the Greeks, carried through the Romans, the Christians. I think the founders certainly believed that as well. And I think that the notion of virtue is directly related to what it means to be a human being. If I can't know the truth, then I can't define the virtue of justice. If I can't define the virtue of justice, then I can't know what justice is. And we can't talk about it. Then I'm not able to do justice. I'm not able to be a just man, or I'm not able to make just judgments, right? It is necessary. It seems self-evident that man has the ability to know ideas that are immaterial, right? And it would seem to me even necessary that if I'm doing something immaterial, abstracting, right? I'm observing things that I can see in reality and I'm drawing them into my mind and I'm holding them there, right? I don't have an elephant in my mind when I go to the zoo and I see an elephant, right? I don't have an elephant in my brain, a big elephant in there, right? But if I close my eyes, I have the image of that 2,000-pound pachyderm, right? I have abstracted this thing from reality and I have brought it into my mind. That must require, I would suggest, some immaterial capacity, and I would suggest that that is the intellect and the will. So those things are important. Today, what I just want to talk about then is more specifically virtue and its relation to the human being, and then the ends of that thing and the ends of the liberal arts education. We're going to start then by talking a little bit, first quoting Plato from the Republic. This quote, ever since I've read it, this quote has always just been so important to me, and I come back to it a lot. I think it's very important. Plato says, by maintaining a sound system of education and upbringing, you produce citizens of good character, and citizens of sound character with the advantage of a good education produce in turn children better than themselves and better able to produce still better children in their turn. Now, this quote from Plato always gets me to thinking about what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to pursue moral excellence? And how do I pass that on to my own family, right? And then for me, as the head of school, how do we do that in the building? How do we do that for the children? How do we raise the bar for these students so that they prefer the superior things and that that's what they want above all else, and that they want to live in a society like that? And they want to be a part of, they want to play the part that they're meant to play in their society. What I say often is that what we do here is not college prep. Yes, children will be prepared students will be prepared to go to college when they leave here. We have a campus advisor. She has them all ready to go to college. But what we really do is sculpt the soul. And what that means is that when a student is getting ready to leave here, our hope for them, right, is that they will be thoughtful, articulate, well-rounded, great-souled men and women, and that they'll be so caught up in that human flourishing that accompanies those things that they will be so confident that whatever they choose to do, whether it's going off to college or becoming an Aristotelian carpenter, which the world needs more carpenter philosophers, I think. Whether they choose to do those two things, they will be confident in themselves and who they are and the choice that they make. And they will be confident not only for themselves and in that choice, but for their families and their future, and then for society in performing their civic duty, right? And I think I started with Plato there because I think in order for society to recover a time of unity and peace, it's important for us to recognize what has to go into that, right? And that is that we have to maintain a sound system of education, which includes understanding what it means to be human and revitalizing this conversation around virtue and what virtue is and how the soul, the intellect, and the will know the truth, pursue goodness, and then because of those two things, are ordered to the pursuit of virtue, the best ways of living. How am I funny? If I'm funny, if I have a sense of humor, am I pursuing it in the right way? Am I too funny? Do I think everything's funny all the time at everybody's expense? If that's the case, I may be, as Aristotle would say, a buffoon. That's buffoonery, right? That's the excess. It's too much. How do I bring it back and find the balance? Because being funny is good, right? It's good to have a sense of humor. But how do I do it in such a way that it's virtuous, that I found the right mean, the place in the middle? And this is the thing that the education of the liberal arts is ordered to, but it requires our understanding of what it means to be human, the nature of the human soul, and then the necessity of inculcating the right virtues and pursuing them in the right way. And this is, I think, what Plato is getting at when he talks about a sound system of education and upbringing, right? First, the education, and then the upbringing. So you have to have the family involved in that education. The first educators of children are parents, right? I've mentioned that before. Children learn everything from you as parents, from us as parents, right? And then if we're going to send them off to school, then that education has to be rooted in wanting those children to become great citizens great human beings. And that's the goal of this education that we're providing here. And the classical education, I think, then really seeks this in a number of ways and is kind of defined by its aims. It seeks then, we've kind of said, after human excellence. And human excellence requires a well-ordered soul, which we've kind of talked about. It requires the mind and the will to be pursuing the truth and knowing the good and choosing the right way in order to pursue truth and goodness and the best things at all times. And that means we're able to distinguish what's superior from what's inferior, right? That means that I am pursuing wisdom, the highest things, right? Ordered well, ordering my mind well, so that I can prudentially make good prudential judgments about things. I can see things rightly, so I can understand them properly to make good choices for myself. And I'm always elevating the superior things. In the past, I think I've said that's why we don't do vocational training, right? The first thing we have to do, if we do the vocational training, we're sort of inverting the thing. We're teaching students how to do things before we teach them how to be. And the first thing we have to do if we want to get back to that well-ordered society is recognizing that we have to first learn how to be. I have to know who I am. I have to know how to choose well. And we have to help children learn how to do that, right? And so we have to prefer the superior things first. And that's what education should do. True education is ordered to those disciplines and how those disciplines lead us into becoming lead us to a well-ordered soul. And the love of human excellence then instills a love in us, in our heart, a desire for the most excellent things, truth, goodness, and beauty, right? And we make those things a way of life. We pursue them, right? That's one of the primary aims of the liberal arts education, is helping to inculcate a love for the right things, right, in the soul. Those are habits, right? And the mind and the will have to want the right things. The will has to want them, right? It has to desire it above all things. The desire to know Latin, which means I'm going to have to go home, as I am told by Mr. Cambeck, and do Latin. If I want to become good at Latin, I can't just sit in class. I have to do it. And it doesn't require me to spend hours every night. He tells me 10, 15 minutes a night. If I do some Latin, I'm going to become good at Latin. It aims at excellence. It also aims at virtue. One of the other aims of what we do here, now that we know what it means to be a human being, now we're going to say, these are the aims. This is what we're going to do. We're going to aim at human excellence. We're going to aim at virtue. Arete from the Greek is the word for excellence. And so we seek these virtues, right? And the two primary parts of the liberal arts education, the two primary virtues that we're seeking are what we would say generally are the intellectual virtues and the moral virtues, right? And so it's abstract and practical, right? And so yeah, you'll come in and you'll see students and they'll be sitting around in class. Not too long ago, Dr. Lutrulio told me a story. Said, Mr. Garcia, I went and sat in Dr. Rager's 11th grade class, his literature class, and they're reading Moby Dick, and they're in this Socratic discussion. And I said, that's that class with all the guys, right? And he said, yeah, all those 11th grade guys. And he said, and they're talking about Moby Dick. And Dr. Rager's not even engaged. He's just sitting back. He's asked them a question, and all of a sudden they've gone on this course, and they're discussing these abstract ideas amongst each other, the greatest ideas. And they're quoting texts, they're flipping back and forth in their book, and they're having this great conversation about predestination. And they're doing that, right? They're examining this abstract idea, right? But the reality is a lot of those abstract ideas are also practical. They have an effect on who we are and what we do, right? And what we do the good that we know, I think. I think that's a fair thing to say. The will and the intellect work in harmony with each other. So I know things and I choose things, and the choices I make are based on the things that I know and the things that I know and believe to be good. And so these abstract conversations are really meant to be practical, moral, help us to choose, make better moral choices, right? To be a more upright human beings. Virtue itself, right, is considered in the individual as it relates to other people, right? It's never really in isolation. And this is, I think, the thing that happens very often in the modern world. There's this sense of, well, freedom is this rugged individualism where I get to do what I want to, when I want to whom I want to, without consequence, because that's freedom. And I would argue that might be license and not freedom. And the true freedom is the happiness that accompanies a life that is lived well and considered in relation to other people. And that requires us to think about the life of virtue. What is the right way to act in this situation? What is the right virtue that I need here, right? And so I think that's important for us to understand. And that's part of what we seek to do here with the education here. We seek the common good, I would say, above the individual good of a student. That doesn't mean we're not concerned with the individual good of a student. But what it can't do is supersede the good of the entire classroom, right? So as an example, you have a classroom, and the classroom is doing literacy essentials, and they're all trying to become master mechanics of the language, right? That's what I say, literacy essentials, the literacy program, the phonics program is like teaching students to be language mechanics. And so they can understand it and take it apart and diagnose it, all these things. And then you have a student that's in the classroom who, you love, but is always slowing it down, stopping it, disrupting the class, doesn't have the right habit of how to be in class, and so always needs the individual attention. We have to start trying to figure out with that individual how we're going to fix that for the good of the whole class. And that means that could mean a number of things, right? But we'll have to be involved in that, and we can't elevate the individual good of that student above the good of the whole class. And I would say that a thriving society or civilization really sort of demands everybody to be on that page, thinking about that and how are we going to hold each other accountable and elevate each other and demand the best from each other. I've sort of talked about this when I've talked about what it means to be human, and in other places, the end of the human person is happiness. We choose the things we choose because we perceive that there's some happiness attached to it. Sometimes, what I mean by happiness is a lasting thing, lasting, enduring quality in the soul that can't be taken from you, even at a difficult time. What I don't mean by that is pleasure. We can't choose things because there's a pleasure attached to them. We certainly can. But pleasures generally tend to be fleeting and more physiological, right? I experience when I'm a student in the classroom and I make all my peers laugh at the expense of the teacher and the pace of the class, there's a pleasure attached to that. It's fleeting though, because now it's over and I've been asked to please don't do that again. And in order to have that experience again, that pleasure, the good feeling, I've got to disrupt the class again to get that pleasure. And that's certainly not going to bring about a lasting happiness in the soul that can't be taken away, right? What that is going to bring about is perhaps a trip to the dean's office in a little while, right? And that's generally not happy because parents get called, all those things, right? And so when we're talking about happiness, what we're talking about is making choices that are increasing our virtue and therefore helping us to flourish, and then bringing about unity and peace to the best of our ability. We're doing the right thing all the time, right? And so the peace begins within us, in our soul. Is everybody going to respond to our good choices in a way that's going to create peace? Not always. Sometimes if we have to make decisions about justice, not everybody's going to respond to them in a way that's going to keep peace. But the first place we have to have peace is a well-ordered soul. So interiorly, and that begins with choosing well and doing the right things. So the end of a classical education, just like the end of life for Aristotle, and for all of the ancients and the medievals, the founders, is happiness, right? The flourishing of the human soul. And the flourishing of the human soul depends on the cultivation of intellectual and moral virtue. The more and more we choose well, the more our soul increases in virtue. The more it increases in virtue, right, the more capable we become of doing well and choosing well. It becomes easier for us. It becomes more joyful for us. What was once hard, what was once difficult in the beginning, when I first chose to stop interrupting the class, was hard. And then as time went by, and I decided to start taking notes, and I began to understand the material, and I began to be able to have greater discussions about it, it became a joyful experience, right? Because now I'm starting to understand and to know these things. And so the first thing is that happiness, the end of the education is happiness. That's one of the ends of a classical education, right? And so we want to depends on our ability to cultivate intellectual and moral virtue. How important is this? Did the founders think it was important? I think they did. And here's why I think they did. I have this laundry list of quotes from the founders. And I can't go through them all here to make this podcast take like an hour and a half. But I'm going to give you a couple. And here's one. Ben Franklin says, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters." Right? What does he mean by that? The whole American experiment is based on this idea of self-governance. The idea that you are going to prefer the best things, the superior things, and rightly order your soul. That we're going to do that together, right? And that we first govern ourselves. That's the first place. And we have to govern ourselves well. And that real freedom is not license. It demands our pursuit of virtue, because virtue doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's always considering the other people. It's in relation to others, right? And so the more that nations become corrupt and vicious, right, the less people are self-governing themselves, the more necessary it is for someone else to govern them. It's Ben Franklin. It's an important part of what we're doing, right? Okay. So how does a liberal arts education speak to that? That's kind of what we're getting at here. The attributes of a classical education. So if we're thinking about Franklin, if we're thinking about these ideas of self-governance, one of the attributes of a liberal arts education is that it's humane. It fulfills our nature, right? It's thinking and reasoning. Our nature, I talked about in the last episode, our love of knowledge, our desire for the truth, and our desire for the good, right? The liberal arts education is naturally ordered toward fulfilling that part of who we are and to elevating it. That's why and I've mentioned this before, that's why we don't think of vocational training as the highest thing. Rather, we think of that really, we invert those two things. We put the humane education, the idea of human flourishing and the pursuit of helping man order his soul well above vocational training. We think that's secondary to the sculpting of man's soul, right? Our first concern is a life lived well. It's a liberal education. If you've seen our video on virtue, you heard Mr. Rose say in that video that it's an education for the free man, right? We just heard the quote from Franklin a minute ago, right? That the free man is the man whose will is ordered to the good and is pursuing the good. I want to give hopefully what I think is an example of what I'm saying about that. When I'm teaching class, oftentimes when this conversation about freedom comes up, I have often asked students, when I've said, hey, I think your will is ordered to the good. It means that you're meant to choose well, to have a well-ordered soul, and we have to know the right things in order to do that well. That's part of my job as a teacher, is to help you figure that out. So then the example I give them is this. I say, how many of you have some electronic gadget at home, an iPad or something like that, and you don't live close to relatives, and you use your iPad to speak with those people, so you can have that sort of face-to-face conversation with them? Oh yeah, the whole class raises their hand. Of course, everybody has one because everybody has a phone. So they don't even have to have an iPad. They all have phones, and they FaceTime, all that stuff. Right? So everybody has it. So they all raise their hands. So everybody knows what I'm talking about. And then I say, look, would you take that thing and submerge it at the bottom of a pool and then try to use it at the bottom of the pool in order to FaceTime this relative whom you love so dearly on your gadget? And of course, they all say no. And I say, well, why wouldn't you do that? Well, it'll break. It's not made for that. That's right. It wasn't designed to be used in that way. It's not designed to, the end of that thing, the gadget, the electronic gadget, is not best executed or used at the bottom of the pool. And in fact, if you choose to use it that way, it may bring about its destruction. In the same way, the human person's soul is ordered to the good as an end. What does that mean? Does it mean that you cannot choose poorly? And the answer is no. You can definitely do that. People can do that. I think we've seen that throughout the course of history. We read about it in the books, in the history, in the literature, right? There have been bad choices, and they've occurred. And that's part of history. There's also been great choices, and men who chose well and preferred the superior things and chose them above all other things, right? But that requires a well-ordered soul, right? And that happiness depends on us recognizing that what the soul was made for, what it was designed for, is the good. Can I use it in some other way? I can. And if I do, what might be the end of that? And it could be, right, that there's a breaking of the soul, right? And that's what I mean when I say liberal, freedom, using our freedom well. It seeks to lead students out of the bond, right, of sort of ignorance and vice. If we have children, we know that children are not born into the world with wisdom or virtue, like naturally and necessarily. Certainly there are some natural virtues that our children have and those sorts of things, but we must lead them. I said this in the last episode, that Aristotle says that the truest education is the education that from infancy is teaching children the right way to navigate pleasure and pain. Because it is pleasure and pain that oftentimes force us to run from virtue, from doing the right thing, right? And so we have to teach children the right way, how to overcome their fears, how to not be afraid to sacrifice or to experience a little hardship, right? Working hard sometimes can feel like suffering, but the end of that can be a great good. And so the education of the liberal arts is the education for free men, and it seeks, right, to help them to grow in knowledge, because that's what they were made for, and to seek the good, not vice, because that's what they were made for, right? So it's the education of the free man. It frees students too from this sort of existence wherein they can only see what their little blinders on, what's right in front of them in their own little world, right? And that they can be turned in on themselves, right? To help them to encounter other times, places, and practices and other ideas that maybe they haven't yet, right? Which can help to broaden their understanding of themselves and the world around them. And it's the education, I think, that is most fitting for free people, because it's the education that seeks to help them flourish and to pursue what is natural to their person, which is the happy life, the life of virtue. It's a traditional education. It's 2,500 years old, right? It's the education of the West. It's the reason that great civilizations were built. I said, I think in the last episode, that when you look at the history of the West, you see all these different governments over time, and you see that America wasn't born in that vacuum, right? You see the democracy, pure democracy in Greece. You see the republic in Rome and the constitutional monarchy in England. And all of a sudden you realize that the founders must have had some kind of liberal education to have understood all of those things and to try to figure out a way in which we could bring them together and create the greatest country in the history of the world, right? It's a traditional education. It requires us to look back at the West and the ancients and the wisdom, right, that they had to offer us. It studies all of those civilizations, right, ancient all the way up to modern in America, with a particular focus on the West, right? I think it was the historian Toynbee who said that we're never more than a generation away from barbarism. Never more than a generation away from barbarism. That's why the liberal arts education is so important, right? Because it's constantly taking children, right? As I said just a minute ago, taking them from their sort of ignorance and vice and bringing them into the world in which they can flourish and understand the virtues and to choose well and to know well. So, having talked a bit about the attributes of a classical education, having done an entire podcast on the first principles of what it means to be a human being, I want to talk a little bit now about the means of a classical education. Okay, so I think that we spend a lot of time in the modern world discussing the method, the way that we do things. Most of the arguments I have with people are not philosophical. They really are, you're not doing it the right way. This is the way you have to do it. You have to do it like this. Everybody does it like this. Why are you trying to do it differently? That's my conversations almost always center around the method. Why are you doing whole group teaching? My student is he's a visual learner. And I think we conquered that when we talked about the five senses. There's no such thing. Everybody is human, has five senses, and learns through those five senses. If I put a beautiful Caravaggio up for the students to look at, they're great, and they might get some sense of beauty. There might be something they could learn from just looking at it. But they wouldn't know that it was Caravaggio. They wouldn't know that it was the prodigal son. They would need me to help lead them to that in some way, auditorily maybe through some writing that they read, something, right? We need all of our senses to learn. So those discussions around method, really, if they're not centered on the first principle, what it means to be a human, soul, intellect, truth, will, goodness, five senses, soul governing pleasures and pains, if it's not centered on those things, then what are we doing with the methods? I would argue it becomes very experimental because we don't believe there's a fundamental foundational principle. So the means of classical education are incredibly important. And I think it's important for us to talk about them. And it's important for us not to shy away from them. And it's important for us to be committed to them. In practice, what does it look like then? There are a considerable variety about materials and things like that, but the broadest agreement centers on the curriculum and then the art of teaching, right? And so the first thing is the curriculum. In our case, we are really, 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 really blessed to be working with Hillsdale College in Michigan. They have created the curriculum. It is like our Bible. We refer to it all the time. We hold teachers accountable to it. It's deeply rooted in the tradition of Western civilization and those first self-evident principles, all of the literature and the history and the science and the math and the music and the art, all of it is deeply rooted in that. Since the Middle Ages, the curriculum itself of the liberal arts is centered around the seven liberal arts of learning. So you have the trivium, the grammar, the logic, and the rhetoric. And then you have the quadrivium, music, arithmetic or math, geometry, astronomy, some type of science. And then the primary sort of materials for us center around those sort of texts, those primary texts, right? Am I going to put a history book in your hand so you can read what some person thinks about Aristotle and the Greeks and the Romans? I don't generally want to do that. Why? There's enough content out there from those people themselves that it would make more sense that we just read the author themselves, right? And so for that reason, the content of the curriculum, the means by which we teach, centers around the bone literae, the good books, right? The good books throughout the course of history that man has read, right? Gilgamesh, I mentioned previously, and Aristotle, and A Christmas Carol, and the Aeneid, and the Iliad, and the Odyssey, and Robin Hood, right? Charlotte's Web, all of those different great books that help us to, through story, understand what it means to be a human being and to see nature in all of its glory and beauty. So the great books, and the trivium and the quadrivium, and then the classical languages. So Latin and Greek. Students start learning in the lower school, in the later grades in the lower school, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, they start learning Latin vocabulary, which is just a preparation because when they get into middle school, the more vocabulary they have by the time they hit middle school, the much easier it will be to start working into the grammar. And then hopefully by high school, we'll have them reading great works in Latin and Greek. Why? Because the West is formed through Latin and Greek. All of the greatest works of history were, for us, were mostly written in Latin and Greek, and it gives us access in a primary, like in a, the first way, right, without a translation in the way, to read those texts in the through the mind of the original author. And then the other means is the teacher, right? And so the art of teaching, recovering the art of teaching. It's important to understand that teachers aren't, the greatest teachers weren't really necessarily first and foremost entertainers. They weren't there just to keep an eye on the children to make sure that they got along well, that their social and emotional elements of their human nature were being taken care of throughout the course of the day. Their primary function really was to sculpt the souls of the children, right? To lead them, to mentor them, and to guide them into the truth that they can know through their intellect and the good that they should do through their will, right? And so recovering the art of a sort of Socrates who stands before them and leads them through earnest dialogue and an honest examination of reality through questioning and discussion and those sorts of things. It's student-centered, and it's concerned primarily then with the formation of the great-souled man or woman, right? The sculpting of the soul. And the reality is that the sculpting of the soul needs something to sculpt it. It needs a sculptor, right? If we're going to form something, someone needs to be the formator, and that is the teacher. So the curriculum doesn't teach itself. It isn't just the curriculum. We can put the curriculum in front of students, but that isn't going to change their lives. what changes their lives is the curriculum, right? The beauty of the whole thing and the way that it fits together in its synthesis, and the encounter with a teacher who loves teaching, who loves children, who loves the discipline that they're teaching as a mastery of it, and believes that it's real and true and good and beautiful, right? And that it's made for the sculpting of the soul. It's essential for us to get back to the idea, the notion that those with more wisdom and knowledge should actually share it with those who have less, right? And I talked about this a little bit in the last episode. Aristotle says that real and true education is the education of the human being from infancy in the right pursuit of pleasure and pain, right? From infancy. Those people who have the most wisdom ought to be guiding those people with the least, and that tends to be children, right? And so that's the goal of teaching, is to become the master who is leading these people to wisdom, these children, these students, about the right things. They're as important as the curriculum. The two things really can't be separated. You could have the curriculum with a teacher who doesn't maybe love it or believe it, and that's really going to do harm to inculcating the truth and the goodness and the beauty in the curriculum. Right? And so it's important that those two things go together. Right? You could have a great person who's a teacher but hasn't mastered the discipline, doesn't know it very well, isn't able to communicate it, maybe doesn't live it out, and that's going to do harm. Right? And so we want to find those two things. That's the means. That's part of what we're trying to do here, is to hire great soul teachers and help teach them the art of teaching. There's three main ways I think that teachers do this with students. The first is that they strive to instill or inculcate the virtues, the good habits, the habits of a rightly ordered life, right? And they do that not just by lecturing well or mastering the discipline well or doing a great Socratic discussion well. Those aren't the only ways. Those things alone would fall flat on a student if the teacher did not have the habit of leading a great life. Students see that in teachers. There's nothing more important than a teacher modeling what the students are to become. What we want to see in the students, we have to see in the teachers. That's a primary expectation in the work of the community at Naples Classical Academy. That's a thing that we're always talking about and working on. And one of the things I'm most proud of is the way that the teachers in this building have come together with each other, work together, push each other to be better, and help each other. It's a very beautiful culture. And then a student has to have the habit of listening, right? Has to have the good habit of listening, and then desire to inculcate that knowledge. And so teachers are striving to instill those good habits by modeling them and teaching them, right? A good teacher is asking questions and listening well to his students. And then they exhibit the same, a great teacher exhibits the same intellectual and moral virtues that they seek. I think these two things kind of go together. And so there's often in the classroom instruction in these sort of various things. And we see that all of this comes together through the curriculum and the teachers believing, and you read the books and the teachers love it and they want to talk about it. And they're so excited when they come across some great aspect in the curriculum, the conversion of Scrooge at the end of A Christmas Carol. And you get to that part in the book after you've read about his miserable life, and all of a sudden you're talking about the change in his soul and his heart, the reordering of his will to the good, and his love of the truth, and his desire to be good to his neighbor and to be a great friend for everybody. It's a moment of pure joy, right? And now you're having these conversations with people who believe it is possible and real and good and true. And you're sharing that wisdom with children about how that came about and what does this mean for him in the newness of his life, right? And so those are parts of the means, right? Of the curriculum, the teachers, the content, we hold that in the highest place. Methods and techniques of delivery, they can kind of vary. There are a variety of ways in which we sort of teach in the classroom, and they can all be effective. And some are more effective than others, and some are good, right? We talk about this as the great conversation, so we want to see a high degree of questioning and Socratic dialogue, right? But that's a method. And so there are other methods, right? Seminar is a sort of extension of Socratic dialogue. Socratic dialogue really is sort of teachers putting the heavy burden of the thinking and talking and explaining on the students by crafting great questions in class, whether it's math or physics or literature or history, in order to put the burden on the onus on the students to think about, know, and explain the things that they've learned, right? So that's the Socratic dialogue. Seminars a really sort of fixed example of this, where we might put students in a different position. We expect them to read a text and to come in prepared to have a discussion, a civil discussion among themselves about that great text, right? And so that's another way. And then you have lecture, right? We've all had the lecture experience. It's happening now. Experimentation, which happens, primarily in science classes, but can also happen in other classes. And then recitation, we do that here primarily in lower grades, and we're looking to expand that into the middle school next year with the great recitation of great poems throughout the course of history. We do that K-5 every month. We have poetry and prose. Parents come in, their students have memorized a poem with their class, and they recite their poem. And then models for emulation, and that can come through the literature and the history, but then also the life well lived by the staff and in the school culture. I think those are all very important parts of the means, right? And then one other part of the means is then the environment, right? The very careful attention to the school's environment that can really aid in helping students to focus on the higher things, the most superior things. So the expectation that there's going to be order, not just in the classroom, but in the hallway, in the lunchroom, out at recess when they're running around, right? The civility and decorum and a sense of sort of personal responsibility, right? That stems from rightly ordered freedom, a rightly ordered will, the desire for the good, choosing well, right? That's a part of the school culture. We have to help inculcate that by the way that we live and we teach and we talk and the expectations that we have in the school. And then discouraging the kind of conduct that interferes with learning and denies other people the respect that's due to them. The classroom is a sacred space. It is ordered to the discovery of the truth. And we have to prefer that because it's good for us. And if that's not what we prefer, then that means we have to fix that, right? No individual student has the right to sabotage the learning of the community, the 20 other students in the class, right? And so we have to make sure that we're all on the same page and we're helping them to choose well, right? That student who loves the pleasure of hearing his classmates laugh, we have to help him overcome that bad habit. It's not the right time, the right place, or the right way, or for the right reason. And therefore, it misses the mark on the sense of humor in terms of its virtue, right? And so that's part of the means of the classical education. Uniforms, they aid in unity and order, and they're a visible sign of our unity in the pursuit of the mission, right? We're not all in some different journey together here. We're all together pursuing these things like a team. Often I say, ask the students, how many of you are on a sports team? Most of them raise their hand. when you play in a game, do you ask coach, can I wear my shorts, my jean shorts or my jeans or any of those other things? No, you're proud to be a part of that team. You're proud to be a part of that mission. And you're proud to pursue that end together. And the sign that you're doing that is your uniform, right? When I was in law enforcement, I wore the same uniform every day, got up, got out of bed, put it on, happily did that. Never asked the boss, can I have a jeans day? I just wore my uniform. And I was proud of the men that I served with, the work that we did, the good that we tried to accomplish together. And that uniform was always a sign to me of our unity in the pursuit of that mission. That, to me, is really at the heart of what it means to wear a uniform. Now, there are some other reasons for it. It helps us to sort of get away from looking at each other and judging each other based on some of the sort of basest and most material and banal things, right? And to start thinking of the goodness that's in the person that I'm sitting next to, even if I don't know them very well, even if I'm not their best friend, because I'm not thinking about whether I have cooler shoes or better makeup or any of those things, right? I'm focused on the highest things, the most superior things. That's an important part of it. And then beauty, making sure the campus is clean, putting beautiful artwork up that reflects the history and the tradition of the West, that elevates our mind, right? Those are the most important things. The means. So I want to sort of end here by saying that all of this, the means, right, the attributes, the nature of man, what it means to be a human being, all those things that we've discussed in the last 2 episodes really are at the service of man's happiness and his human flourishing. The goal of all of it. That's the goal of this education. It's the goal of discovering what it means to be a human being. It's the goal of discovering the standards that are out that exist in nature, that unify man and bring them together, and then trying to put them into practice to the best of our ability. And I think the framers of the Constitution recognize this. I could quote them a million different ways. Every founder has said something about the necessity of virtue and the pursuit of it freely from our will in order for a rightly ordered society and the happiness of man. But I give you Sam Adams. Neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manner are universally corrupt. He therefore is the truest friend of liberty of his country who tries most to promote its virtue. We do the good that we know. That's the point. We have to want to know the truth. The two things work in harmony, so we have to pursue those two things together and then do the true and good things that we know. We have to prefer them and choose them. No matter how hard they are, we can't run from them, right? The first principles, which are self-evident, according to the framers of the Constitution, they lead us to our end. The means by which, and are the means by which we should pursue them, right? The first principles have to be firmly rooted in our lives, right? So that we could see our end clearly, which is happiness and unity with each other. In order for that to be accomplished, according to Sam Adams, a man cannot allow his soul, his mind, and his will to be corrupt with falsity and with vice. He must prefer the best things, right? In order for us to come together and to be unified and to have joy and have peace and unity in society. That was the will of the founders. And it should be our will today for the good of this society. Thanks for joining me again. Until next time, sapientia operibus vindicata.